This episode of Matt's Mysteries contains material that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Matt's Mysteries. I'm Matt, also known as We Have Sherlock Holmes at Home. Say that 5 times really fast. And today, we're looking at a case that involves trying to cancel someone before subtweeting existed. This case has all sorts of twists and turns. So, if you like pen pals, buses, mystery, and forbidden love, then stick around and bust out your favorite stationery and fountain pen, because we're going to take a look at the case of the Circleville Letter Writer. Episode 6 of Matt's Mysteries. In 1976, Mary Gillispie was a simple bus driver, just going about her daily routine, living what seemed to be a perfectly ordinary life in Circleville, Ohio. But that life, that peaceful existence, and any shred of normalcy was about to be shattered in the most bizarre and kind of unnerving way. Allow me to explain. It all began with a letter. Or rather, several. What I mean by that is that several Circleville residents began receiving rather ominous letters, filled with intimate details revealing their deepest and darkest secrets. Mary eventually became the fixation of this creepy, borderline obsessive letter-writing campaign, with the writer remaining anonymous. Like I said before, these letters were incredibly intimate, haunting, and downright chilling. This phantom writer knew things, incredibly personal things about Mary, details that should have been private, sacred even. She was a married woman, a mother, a hard worker, and this mystery writer claimed to know it all. Even worse still, they claimed to be watching her. And if that wasn't enough, they also accused her of something truly scandalous, an intense and kind of steamy affair with the local school superintendent. The message of the letters was made clear. Mary was ordered to end the affair, and quickly, or the writer would ramp up their efforts and subsequent harassment. Just imagine every breath you take, every move you make, every step you take being watched. You thought I was going to make a joke there, didn't you? Anyway, likely to nobody's surprise, Mary was shaken to her core. And I mean, who wouldn't be? At first, she did what many of us might do. She hid the letters. She kept them secret, locked them away, and kept her eyes peeled, hoping, praying that the writer would slip up, make some sort of mistake, and ultimately reveal themselves. Now, I can't speak for everyone, but I absolutely sweep some problems under a metaphorical rug, hoping they'll go away on their own. But I don't think I could just pretend I wasn't getting frequent, threatening letters from an unknown individual. Is it just me? Anyway, the paradigm changed the moment the writer dragged her husband, Ron, into the fray. A new letter arrived, both naming and threatening Ron. Like the message before it, This message was clear. If Mary refused to acknowledge and cease her affair with the superintendent, then Ron had better put a stop to it, or else. Or else what, you might be asking? And to that, the writer would say that Ron would die. If you're thinking that escalated things and escalated them fast, you're not wrong. Anyway, this threat was followed by a clear ultimatum that stated,
"End the affair, or the letters and every intimate detail they covered would be made public in 2 weeks' time."
And the clock was ticking. Completely terrified and at a loss, Mary and Ron confided in 3 trusted family members: Ron's sister, her husband Paul, and Paul's sister. They had to do something, anything, to make this nightmare come to an end. And so, they hatched a plan and took a rather bold step. Paul himself wrote letters to those they suspected might be the mastermind or masterminds behind the harassment, hoping to ultimately bluff the writer into silence. And, oddly enough, for a while, it seemed that they'd won. The letters stopped, the threats faded. It felt like victory. However, this apparent victory would be rather short-lived, and it was only a matter of time before tragedy would strike. In August of 1977, a phone call shattered the fragile peace of an otherwise normal summer day. Ron was the one who answered, and he was met by a voice on the other end claiming to be the infamous Circleville Letter Writer. It is said that in that moment, Ron immediately knew their identity and who was ultimately behind this torment. In an odd twist, he didn't say a word to literally anyone about the identity of the caller.
What?
And you might be asking yourself, why didn't he reveal who the writer was if he allegedly knew their identity as soon as he answered the call? To that, I will say, I don't know. If he did, this case may have been cracked wide open, and you wouldn't be hearing a cartoon thumb in a trench coat discuss it. Anyway, instead of doing what I just said, Ron grabbed his gun, stormed into his truck, and sped off into the night. Before angrily hanging up and arming himself, the stalker had one more thing to say to Ron. They were watching him. They were watching his home. They were watching his truck. Mere minutes after his interaction on the phone with the alleged stalker, Ron and his truck would be found. His truck was a twisted and mangled wreck, having been wrapped against a tree. Ron had sadly passed away in the accident. Investigators were called to the scene, and they discovered something kinda odd. Ron had fired at least one shot from his gun before the crash. Now, the obvious question is, what was he shooting at? Or, more accurately, who was he shooting at? My not-so-educated guess points to one of 2 possibilities, one of which I'll elaborate on in just a moment. The other is pretty obvious. In his reckless vehicular rampage, Ron spotted the writer, or at least someone. He may have just seen a silhouette or something similar, and had taken aim, firing the fateful shot. Now, I'm Canadian and have fired like 3.5 firearms at various ranges in my lifetime, so my knowledge of guns is super limited. As such, take what I'm about to say with a generous helping of salt. However, I'd argue that firing from inside his truck would have been incredibly loud, and that, plus any sort of muzzle flash, could have ultimately led to Ron losing control of his truck, crashing into a tree. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe was investigating the death, And after some questioning and a handful of suspects ruled out, he made his ruling. It's probably what you expect, but he ruled it an accident, the result of a man far too drunk to control his vehicle, who tragically lost his life. But wait, I didn't mention that before. Ron's blood alcohol level was 0.16, twice the legal limit. But here's where it gets a little weird. Ron's family and friends were absolutely floored by that revelation. According to them, Ron wasn't a drinker, or at least wasn't a drinker like that. Now, I might have an explanation for this, so bear with me. While that may entirely have been out of the ordinary for someone like Ron, but people pushed to their limits can absolutely behave in ways completely outside of their normal mannerisms. This is where my second guess from earlier comes into play. In his dinosaur drunk, ultra paranoid state, Ron may have seen someone, may have seen something period, or had believed he had seen something, leading to him firing his weapon while driving. In this inebriated state, this action could have entirely caused him to lose control of his truck, crashing it into a nearby tree. Also, don't drink and drive, okay? Anyway, several pieces of this story just weren't fitting together, and because of that, the whispers began. Was the sheriff up to something? Was there some sort of cover-up at play? Anyway, just like that, the letters started up again. This time, however, they weren't just targeting Mary and Ron. They were targeting the sheriff himself. Letters began circulating throughout Circleville, accusing Sheriff Radcliffe of covering up the truth. Paul actually supported these claims, saying that the sheriff had originally suspected foul play in Ron's death, but had changed his story after a suspect passed a polygraph test. And we all know how reliable those tests are, don't we? But still, one fact seemed to stand out in the way of these conspiracy theories, and that is Ron's blood alcohol level. How do you explain that away? I mean, I have my sort of theory surrounding that, but nonetheless, it divided the town. What really happened to Ron? And again, who was this faceless writer lurking in the shadows? The mystery only deepened, because despite it all, despite the fear, the threats, the accusations, Mary eventually came forward and admitted what she had been accused of for so long. And what many of you were probably suspecting from the beginning of this rambling mess I call a script. She had indeed been having an affair with the superintendent. I know, so surprising. But don't worry guys, she totally swore up and down that it didn't begin until after the letters had started. I don't think I'm the only one who would call that a case of moving the goalposts in order to save face. Because let's be real, if that were true, it would seemingly imply that these letters incepted the idea of Mary's infidelity into her and the superintendent's heads. And at least to me, that sounds kind of silly and highly unlikely. With that said, that's just my thought on this new revelation. And nonetheless, the affair was seemingly real. But was it the reason for the letters? Or was it just another thread in a truly dark and twisted tapestry? To nobody's surprise, the letters didn't stop there. By the 1980s, they had evolved into something far worse than just written words. The menace was becoming physical, tangible, and incredibly dangerous. In February of 1983, while driving her usual bus route, Mary began to notice something new. She noticed threatening signs posted along the road. Signs that were directed at her. She tried to ignore them at first, but after seeing them day after day, week after week, Mary snapped. One day, she pulled over, stormed up to one of the signs, and in a flustered and likely terrified rage, ripped it down. What Mary didn't know, though, was that behind the sign, lurking in wait, was a death trap. Literally. I know people say literally and don't mean literally, but like literally. Behind that sign was a box, and in that box was a gun, rigged to fire if the sign was pulled in just the right way. A booby trap set to kill. Listen, I know movies like Saw exist, but holy heck, it blows my mind to think that there are real human people out there in the world who build or have built jigsaw-like traps. To me, that's wild, sad, and super creepy. Thankfully, fate spared Mary that day, and she was left shaken but otherwise unharmed by the trap. The investigation that followed was a whirlwind of shocks and accusations. The serial number on the gun had been scratched off in an amateur attempt to erase its origins. But those like me who watch true crime shows like Forensic Files probably know the lab technicians are good. Too good, in fact. They were ultimately able to lift the serial number, tracing the gun right back to Paul. You know, Mary's brother-in-law, Paul. Paul, who'd been trying to help. Paul, who had sent letters in an attempt to scare off the writer. Paul, who was now at the center of this twisted game. Paul insisted that his gun had been stolen. I'll also try and say Paul a little bit less now, but no promises. Despite this insistence, the evidence was mounting. Sheriff Radcliffe had him write out letters for a handwriting comparison, and also had Paul lead officers to his garage where his gun had been stored before it was allegedly stolen. At the end of the day, it wasn't looking good for him, and soon enough, he was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of his sister-in-law, Mary Gillispie. The trial was kinda strange. Paul was never formally charged with the writing of the letters. However, they were used as the cornerstone of the case against him. A handwriting expert did testify that the letters matched Paul's handwriting. His ex-wife even testified against him, saying she suspected Paul had written the letters all along. And then, the final blow. Paul's boss testified that Paul wasn't at work the day the booby trap was discovered. He did have an alibi, but he never took the stand in his own defense. Also, kind of a sidebar, allegedly, during the final stages of the investigation, Paul had actually admitted to Sheriff Radcliffe that he had written 40 to 50 of the letters, though we can't confirm this admission of guilt with absolute certainty. And ultimately, it just wouldn't matter. The jury ended up convicting him. He was sentenced to 7 to 24 years in prison for the attempted murder of his sister-in-law. And just when you thought this case couldn't get any weirder, somehow it does. Even while behind bars, while Paul was locked away in solitary confinement, the letters kept coming. In fact, Paul even received them too. Letters from the so-called real Circleville writer. They taunted him, mocked him mercilessly, telling him they would keep him locked up forever. The letters were postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, and they continued to pour in, long after Paul was locked away. Was the writer of these letters the true culprit, having successfully framed a possibly innocent man? Or had a copycat arisen, assuming the mantle of Circleville Letter Writer from Paul, taking credit for a job they had only just begun? Or did Paul have an accomplice, using them as a means of proving his innocence, since he couldn't possibly have been sending them from prison. Anyway, Paul became eligible for parole in 1990, but those letters were his undoing. His parole was denied. Finally, in 1994, Paul was released, and he never stopped proclaiming his innocence, right up until his death in 2012. But was he truly innocent? We'll get to that in the theories. Here's where the plot thickens once more. Journalist Martin Yant did some digging, and what he found sent another ripple of doubt throughout this already twisted case. Get this, just 20 minutes before Mary came across the booby trap that could have killed her, another driver spotted a man standing near the spot where the trap would be laid. This mystery man was standing next to a yellow El Camino, and here's the kicker. This man didn't match Paul's description at all. And, as it turns out, someone close to the Gillispie family owned that same model and color of El Camino. But who was this man? And what role did he play, if any? Was he the real letter writer, the mastermind behind it all? Or was he a random bystander, coincidentally driving the same color and model of a vehicle driven by someone known to the Gillispie family, coincidentally spotted in the exact area where the letter writer wanted to play a little game with poor Mary? I don't know exactly. But the odds of all of that being a coincidence seem pretty low to me. Unsolved Mysteries was set to air an episode covering the Circleville Letter Writer in 1994. While Mary and Sheriff Radcliffe both declined to be interviewed, the show would go on, until the production team received a postcard with a letter of their very own. This letter claimed to be from none other than the infamous Circleville Letter Writer, and it said,
"Forget Circleville, Ohio. Do nothing to hurt Sheriff Radcliffe. If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay. The Circleville Letter Writer."
It's, eerie, right? Was this really from the infamous writer? Or was it simply a copycat looking for attention from a popular television program? Again, I don't know. I don't know a lot of things. To this day, no one knows the identity of the writer. The Circleville letters remain an enigma, a story of obsession, danger, and a faceless tormentor who may never be unmasked. With that said, the mystery lives on, unanswered, lurking in the shadows of a quiet Ohio town, haunting it forever. All right, let's look at the incredibly short and not at all substantial theories regarding this twisty adventure. Time for the theories. Our first theory points to exactly who you think it would, Paul. This theory states that Paul was indeed the writer after all. A quick refresher, he was married to Ron Gillespie's sister for a time, and as such may have had some serious insight into his and Mary's life. Beyond this, remember it was Paul's pistol that was found in a trap set to end Mary's life. What makes it even more suspicious is that the serial number on this firearm had been partially rubbed off before the trap was set. If Paul's claims that the gun was stolen are indeed true, then why would the would-be killer rub off the serial number? It would honestly just point authorities away from the real killer, and they'd send an innocent man to prison. Even further still is that during the trial, a handwriting expert compared Paul's writing to that of the writer and concluded that there was enough similarity to legitimately name Paul as the Circleville Letter Writer. There are just two factors that may point to a writer that is not named Paul. I mean, he might also be named Paul, but you know, the one we're talking about. The first is that while in prison, Paul received letters from the alleged writer stating their intent on keeping him locked up. While this could be a copycat or an accomplice trying to shift the blame off of Paul, it's pretty suspicious nonetheless. The second factor is the man with the yellow Camino. This man was supposedly seen in the same spot the trap would later be found, and was related to someone suspected of writing the letters. Like I always say, or I've said like once, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And while there is something here, I don't think it's substantial enough to fully remove Paul from our suspect list. But you be the judge. This second theory is our final one, and came about as a result of information gathered by Martin Yant and other investigators. This information suggests that there were at least 3 writers involved in the campaign. Whether they coordinated their efforts or not is unknown, but kudos to them if they did. The 3 suspected individuals and their possible motives are as follows. Number 1, the superintendent's son. You might recall that Mary had a little bit of a fling with the superintendent at a time that the letters would have been circulating. If this theory is to be believed, and the son is involved, it may have been due to him discovering the affair and threatening her out of anger. It may have also been in an attempt to protect both the superintendent and his family from any embarrassment. But again, who knows for certain? Number 2. Random coworker. That's what I called him. Listen, I get it. While this individual sounds like they definitely don't exist, in my research, I came across a theory that points to a coworker of Mary. It was believed that this coworker was obsessively infatuated with Mary, and if this is true, their involvement may have been motivated by a desire to end the affair Mary was having with the superintendent, as well as her marriage to Ron. This way, they could have Mary all for themselves. Because that, totally always works, right? Number 3, Paul's ex-wife, or Ron's sister. It is believed that after Paul and his ex split, she began dating a man that would later be identified as the man standing by the El Camino, who we will now refer to as Camino Guy. One of her relatives actually owned an El Camino during this period, so it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that it may have been used, along with Camino Guy, to create chaos for Mary. But what are her motives? I don't know for sure, though the ex may have discovered the affair between Mary and the superintendent and began the letter writing campaign as a means of ending the affair for the sake of her brother. However, after Ron's tragic accident, the escalation to violence would begin. Possibly out of revenge, but who knows? I get it, it's a stretch, but I suppose it's possible. Were these letters written by a man on the inside? Or were there more than one person involved in this pen pal campaign of doom? And why were these letters going around at all? Personally, I'm of the mindset that the fact that the serial number was rubbed off the attempted murder weapon points to Paul having at least some sort of involvement in this case. Like I said before, why would a thief rub the serial number off of a gun that they stole when it could be traced back to a completely innocent man? It just doesn't compute for me. But with that said, I can't definitively say he acted alone, and possibly wasn't even the writer at all, playing some sort of supporting role in a bigger web this mystery is tangled in. But what do you think? Thank you so much for tuning in to today's mystery. If there's a mystery you'd like me to cover, don't hesitate to leave a comment on the video. If you like what you saw and are interested in learning about more mysteries from a cartoon detective, consider subscribing to the channel. I'll post once a week and will occasionally post twice if I'm feeling extra rowdy. So get ready, because there are a lot of mysteries for me to share. Until the next one, this is Matt telling you to stay mysterious.